live from Milwaukee.
Each day at noon and 5 p.m.
Trump and the RNC powered by a galvanizing of his base.
Then tune in for special RNC coverage.
Thursday night at 8.
This campaign cycle gets more complex by the day.
The Republican National Convention.
All this week.
On Bloomberg 1130 and Bloomberg Television.
This is the Bloomberg Money Minute. Film and TV giant Paramount Global is being sold to David Ellison, son of tech billionaire Larry Ellison, who helped finance the deal with partners. The younger Ellison, no stranger to the business, he's head of Skydance Media, co-producing, co-financing hits like 2022's Top Gun Maverick.
Good morning, aviators. This is your captain speaking.
But taking over Paramount Global won't be easy. The box office is in a slump. Network TV ratings are even worse, and Paramount's two streaming services lose a ton of money. Cost cuts have long been on the table, and Bloomberg media reporter Felix Gillette reports there's now talk of even more, as well as job loss.
They're still talking about, reducing costs by $500 million. There's more cuts that are going to be coming. But it's a typical time in Hollywood where everyone's tightening their belts.
But with thousands of films in its library, a focus on live sports and kids shows, much of Hollywood is hopeful about David Ellison and Paramount. Tom Busby, Bloomberg Radio.
Now a sports update on Bloomberg 1130.
A Yankee win on Sunday will send New York to the All-Star break in first place. And Aaron Judge's 34th home run on Saturday sets a Yankee record for the most home runs before the All-Star break. The Mets are rolling. They've won 5 in a row. They'll try to beat the Rockies and sweep the series on Sunday. At Wimbledon, Carlos Alcaraz plays Novak Djokovic in the men's final on Sunday morning. That's your Bloomberg Sports Update. I'm Dan Gutowski.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Tom Keene with my special guest, David Gura. Of course, the big take out on Bloomberg Podcast, but so much more. David Gura here today on this horrific Sunday morning after an assassination attempt with his wonderful political coverage, all he's done for NBC and NPR, and we're thrilled to have him back with Bloomberg as well. David, you're always way more prepared than I am. What is your insight of what needs to be done by the Trump administration in the next 24 hours?
I'll pick up on what Terry said, and I was struck by the resonance of his comments. And he brought up the fact that sort of what he said today is right in line with what he said after January 6th. And so he's calling for the rhetoric to be calmer and politicians to take a step back, wait a while to comment beyond just expressing their thanks to law enforcement and good wishes to the former president. But I think we have seen in recent weeks, as we were discussing with Terry, a very disciplined Trump campaign. He hasn't been out there fulminating on the campaign trail. He's been content to let Democrats battle it out over their prospects and what's going to happen in Chicago. I expect that we will have this reframed for us in that marquee speech in Milwaukee.
And this is Thursday night. But they got to get from Tuesday. They got to get Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and they've got the usual victims lined up to speech. Is anyone listening to those speeches anymore? I mean, Wendy Schiller remembers, David Gura, when we hung on every single word within the pageantry. From where you sit, David, the pageantry's gone, right?
The pageantry is gone, but before this happened yesterday, there was a strong effort by the former president to make this must-see TV, for lack of a better term. He hasn't named his vice presidential pick, and I think that is the thing that most of America would have and will seize on now, is who that individual is going to be and what he or she has to say on the stage in Milwaukee.
On this Sunday morning across America on Bloomberg Radio, on many of our other services as well, David Gura and Tom Keene, a special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance, which means we need a special guest. She is at Brown University. Wendy Schiller joins us, a definitive book on American civics, a sense of history that folds into the present day and our future. Professor Schiller, good morning. When I first heard this news, John Farrow actually called me to tell me of the news, and I thought of George Wallace in 1972. We can take our violence of assassination and assassination attempt back to Garfield, to Lincoln, and frankly beyond. Professor Schiller, why is America so violent in its politics?
Well, I thought about that too. I thought about, of course, Ronald Reagan as well, and I was very grateful to see former President Trump emerge, relatively okay, but he was, in fact, shot in the ear, and then the sadness of having attendees killed and injured is, really just brings us back exactly to these traumatic moments in American political life, where we say, how could that happen? And yet it happens very frequently in America, even relative to any other country, at least in the 20th century and certainly the 21st century. And we have a culture, you can argue it's a gun culture, and that guns are too easy to get. There's a sort of AR-15 argument that's going around. However, as we all know, those prior acts of violence were not committed with AR-15s, so they still happened anyway. And we have to ask ourselves that we have this weird juxtaposition between peaceful transitions of power, which we have had, with January 6th with some exception, but that still happened relatively peacefully after that, and the rest of the world, which has not had that history of peaceful transition of power. So it's this really stark difference between our culture and the violence we see, everyday gun violence, but also political violence, and then our system, which, compared to the rest of the world, remains very peaceful and orderly.
Dr. Schiller, I was in a diner in Brooklyn last night when this happened and looked up at the screen and saw those 15 seconds being replayed over and over again. And I've got 3 kids, 11 and younger, watching it with me and fielded a lot of difficult questions as a result of that. What happened? How did this happen? What does it mean? Is this politics? You teach the American presidency, other classes to Brown undergrads, older than my kids, but I imagine they have similar questions. They haven't lived through this. They don't have a memory of 1981. What do you say to younger people in this country about the state of politics today? What something like what happened yesterday means for the shape of American politics today?
Well, I mean, obviously, you know this too, our political rhetoric has, in fact, declined. We have had periods of time when in the press, people said horrible things about politicians, going back to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It's not that that is new, it's that it's not just politicians, it's people, everyday voters, people sort of not having family conversations, not associating with people because of their political affiliation. It's all that negative partisanship. It's hatred that's now been really cultivated of the other side, and we dehumanize the other side when we hate. And that element has intensified in the last 10 to 15 years. Sadly, your kids, very sadly, and on the kids that I'm teaching, have lived through school gun violence in a way that we did not when I was a kid. So their world is populated with gun violence. They're more used to that than we are. So we look at it as political violence as a threat, but that generation says, will I be safe going to school? So I think these two things have come together in this moment in time.
Is there optimism in Providence that this can change? I think, so it was actually kind of a quaint moment just a couple of days ago when you had this transition of power, peaceful transition of power in London. You heard from Rishi Sunak acknowledging political differences with the guy who defeated him, with Keir Starmer, and a very generous speech from Keir Starmer when he was named Prime Minister as well. And there was something, again, both quaint but also refreshing about that. Can you envision in America, when we get back to that, when things aren't as fraught and there is that kind of comedy, C-O-M-I-T-Y, that we haven't had here in a long time?
I was just thinking this morning about Joe Wilson, when Joe Wilson, Congressman of South Carolina.
Of You Lie fame from the State of the Union address that President
Right, the State of the Union, You Lie. So I was trying to sort of say, when did this happen? Can people on the left or people who don't like Trump say, well, Trump elevated the rhetoric and it's his fault, his speeches, his locker up burglary. But no, we had this under Obama and it started to decline, and the left and the right participates in this. I think it's become, unfortunately, bipartisan. So it's not directly attributed just to Donald Trump in 2015, 2016. It was happening before that, this sort of real visceral anger that really broke all the barriers. At school board meetings, you have people screaming hateful things. We just didn't have that 20 years ago. So am I optimistic that can turn the corner? I do think the pendulum it swings in American politics. So I do think there's a limit that people will tolerate in terms of this rhetoric.
On a Sunday morning, Professor Schiller, and of course the heritage here of George Washington traveling up near your Providence to Newport, Rhode Island, in the Jewish synagogue in the late 18th century, the
Torah synagogue.
The distance of this shot that missed the president, wounding the former president, wounding him, is the distance from the Fifth Avenue synagogue here in New York City, past St. Thomas Fifth Avenue, the Church of Norman Rockwell's painting down to St. Patrick's Cathedral. I mean, where would the Milwaukee Convention, the president at church or coming out of church when he learns of former President Trump's attempted assassination, how does religion change with this assassination attempt as a debate in a construct in America?
Well, I mean, you're really tying something to the breakdown of local communities. It got exacerbated under COVID, but we used to see each other in contexts that were different than politics. Work, for example, church, synagogue, mosque, school, social gatherings. We used to interact with each other far more, personally, and we don't anymore. And the ability to dehumanize, we've seen this with mass shootings and young men. We see this now, and people are objects, they're not human beings, and we don't interact enough with each other outside of politics, where we recognize that we have bonds that connect us. And that is a sociological phenomenon that's been happening with the rise of technology and also, obviously, the pandemic. People talk about going back to work and how nice it is to work at home. Yes, we can all talk about those advantages if you're lucky enough to have them, but they do degrade social bonds in society. And politicians can't fix that. So we're looking to politicians to fix something that is really deeper and broader than what they can handle.
Dr. Schiller, you're heading up the Watson Institute here for a few more months. I gather on an intermittent basis.
She's on sabbatical.
Deserve a sabbatical after that.
A little bit. I got a temporary raise. Yeah.
Very good. Very good.
Job, for next year.
But you're thinking a lot, I imagine, and talking a lot about international relations. And I was struck again following this news, how quickly and in what droves we heard from world leaders about this. Give me your perspective on how this is resonating around the world, based on what we've read, what we've seen so far from world leaders. Obviously, there are plenty of opinions about the proliferation of guns in this country and violence and the rhetoric that we've been talking about. But what's your sense of how other world leaders are watching this unfold?
Well, I think there's a general sense. I mean, we've seen, a punch in the face or the shoulder, I think, in Copenhagen, the Prime Minister of Denmark. We've seen assassination in other parts of the country attempted in the world, like we've seen in Latin America, we've seen in Eastern Europe. So we are seeing political violence all over the world elevate to people who, I'm going to get punched on the streets of Copenhagen. So there's that, right? So I don't think there's that much surprise. And then, of course, there's the gun culture in America. But I think the fear among leaders is that the Trump rhetoric about international relations, and then when Trump can elevate that rhetoric in a way that's fairly feisty, it may concern them that this will solidify support around Trump, and that Trump will win. The election's over, and it's already done, and that we will be living with this on a world stage for the next 4 years. So I think international leaders are really trying to see how this assassination attempt, affects the election going forward, and does it intensify the negative partisanship, sort of divide in the society.
Wendy Schiller, thank you so much. Professor Schiller at Brown University, I'm sure we'll hear from her as we progress to Milwaukee and Chicago as well. Mike Allen, publishing moments ago at Axios, a single phrase, America's stunned. David Gura, that about captures it.
Certainly does, and I referenced sort of how I watched this unfold in that moment.
Difficult
with kids, understood the gravity of it, and I think I, more imaginatively than they, was able to think what could have happened in that moment. I think that's something that's going to stick with a lot of people this morning as they look at those incredible photographs, some of which were captured by Doug Mills, the multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer for the Times, of that bullet. You can see the actual bullet heading for the former president. What could have happened here? And I think that will be the thing that sticks with a lot of Americans as we move ahead to this convention and to the election in November, Tom.
We got much to talk about here. Another 2 hours of our special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance. We got some really wonderful guests coming up. People with Bloomberg, people that we speak to often on surveillance. Also coming up, an academic who's really studied this American agony, back to Andrew Jackson. From New York City, David Gura and Tom Keene, please stay with us. This is Bloomberg Radio.
From the financial capital of the world, broadcasting 24 hours a day
At Bloomberg.com.
and the Bloomberg Business app. This is WBBR New York, Bloomberg 1130. Now, our global news update. This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweet.
We're addicted to the power game, the Fed, the monetary ballet.
Where do you see opportunities in a fixed income space here in 24?
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
AI affecting demand for cloud computing.
And Michael Barr with news.
Another legal setback for Donald Trump, this time across the pond.
The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Good Sunday morning. A special edition of Bloomberg Surveillance. We welcome all of you on Bloomberg Radio across America, around the world. There's so much going on here as we wake up to the day after an assassination attempt. Joining me this morning, esteemed David Gura, of course, the big take with Bloomberg, but so much more in his coverage of America's politics. David, this crept up on me. You were better prepared than I. And that is, on this Sunday morning, we adjust to a different convention in Milwaukee. I can't imagine the conversations going on right now, not only for the security of the former president and the present president, but others as well in Milwaukee.
Yeah, so much of what we have talked about so far, what we'll continue to talk about, is how this message is changed or reshaped as a result of this. So we have, from the Republican National Committee, a sense of who's going to speak at that convention. Many of the marquee speakers are those who are on the former president's short list to be vice president. We'll see what they have to say, but yes, it's an issue of how does the security change at that convention, how does the messaging change as well. We know now the former president is going to be there, dismissing any question of that fact. He's going to speak on Thursday night. A huge question here is, what's he going to say? What overture is he going to make? How is he going to comment on what happened last night in Pennsylvania?
We've got themes to our 3 hours of coverage. This hour we'll look much more to Capitol Hill. Henrietta Trey's to join us here in a moment. But also, David, we haven't spoken that much about 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. President Biden spoke to President Trump last night, which I think is an elegiac moment for an America, as Mike Allen said, stunned. I think that really captures it nicely. But this assassination attempt is an adjustment for the Biden campaign as well.
Yeah, this was to be a quiet weekend for the president. He was in Rehoboth Beach, where he has a home, there with his family. After this happened, he delivered a statement and then made his way back to Washington. He arrived at the White House just after midnight last night. So pushing ahead to the next few hours here, he's due to have another briefing from law enforcement and Homeland Security about the investigation, which is being helmed by the FBI at this point, of what happened in Pennsylvania yesterday. Of course, he's looking ahead to a very important interview that's going to take place on Monday night. He sat down with George Stephanopoulos last week on ABC News. After that disastrous debate, he sits down with Lester Holt tomorrow night in Austin. He's there to give a big speech on race and justice, and was going to have that interview on the field of that. An entirely different interview now. Yes. Lester Holt has 15 minutes with him, and I think it's very safe to say first series of questions now are going to center on how the campaign changes, the stakes change, and what this means for the country as a whole.
Do you expect, and we're going to get to Henrietta Trey's here in a moment, there's an assumption, I'm editorializing, folks, of protest in Chicago. People harken back to 68, which David was too young to remember. But the bottom line is there's an assumption of protest, Israel, Palestine, Gaza, etc. Do you assume protest in Milwaukee, or does that change with this assassination attempt?
I never was expecting, and here I'm editorializing, never expecting huge protests in Milwaukee. Yeah. I think that there were bound to be liberal protesters there on the edges of that convention. But I think the one where there's real fragility is the Democratic convention in August. And so we knew that it was going to involve the kind of protest that you're talking about, what's been happening in the Middle East and the president's policy toward that. But of course, that debate raised the specter of a whole lot more difficulty, more undulations at that convention. President Biden, of course, holding fast that he's the presumptive nominee. He's going to keep running. He's not stepping aside. Whether or not that happens, I think it's going to be messy in some sense. You're going to have protesters from within the Democratic Party upset with how this has proceeded and what's happening. But no, I don't think that Milwaukee is likely to be gripped, nor did I think it was likely to be gripped by the same kind of protest as in Chicago, Tom.
An update to our Bloomberg coverage here, and of course this is Hadriana Lorencren, who he's opened our 8 o'clock hour with, and also the wonderful Jennifer Jacobs. And the adjustment is the FBI has identified a male suspect, Thomas Matthew Crooks, 20 of Bethel Park, south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The incident being treated now officially as an assassination attempt. And there's this, with the multiple shootings. I mean, I don't think it's any different here, David Gura. A motive is yet to be determined. I mean, unfortunately, that is germane, I think, to the next couple days.
Yeah, and we don't know anything about that yet. We do know this identity has been reported from a release from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI heading the investigation now, but we wait for that. I would say this is a huge vacuum of a lack of information, but there is a lot that we don't know yet, and motive certainly looms large, something that we want to get a handle on here in the coming hours and days.
She has expertise on Capitol Hill and the legislative processes of a nation, but far more understands the pulse of the apparatus of our American politics. Henrietta Trey's one of our most popular guests. People lean forward. She's with Veda Partners. Henrietta, your thoughts when you learned of this in the vicinity of the 6:30 hour yesterday evening?
Thank you so much for having me this morning. It was shocking, what should have been a relatively quiet weekend, going into a lot of fanfare and pomp and circumstances of the convention ended up being something that I would say my first takeaway after being, just sort of shocked and awed by the entire event and, thankful that everybody was safe, including the former president, was really just the inevitability of it. It just feels so tense around America. I mean, that's certainly what blew up around me as this was happening, was just, I can't believe that it happened. And yet at the same time, I absolutely can. Things are so fraught and tensions are so high that was really the first takeaway, and the one that cemented in my mind after last night.
Talk more about that if you would. I'm on the same page as you, and I wonder if that's because of the way this general election is being framed. We're hearing of it as a very pivotal election, of course, one where democracy is at stake, where there's the risk of authoritarianism if you listen to the Democrats, if you listen to the Republicans. Donald Trump on that debate stage talking about the very real prospects as he sees them of World War III. Is it that? Is it simply that discreetly, or is it something that's more of a consequence of a kind of slow evolution toward a messier and more fraught and more antagonistic brand of politics in this country?
I think you don't have to single either of those things out. I mean, they're both very valid. You can go back to January 6th, which was obviously something that, we saw, and there were certainly deaths, but our main takeaway was, gosh, it could have been so much worse. I mean, how many senators and lawmakers did we hear say that exact phrase? Just expecting the worst and being grateful that it wasn't that more bad than that. And that's really the takeaway that I had from last night. Thankful that it wasn't worse. I think that sort of sense of everybody's out to get me is definitely the perspective from former President Trump. The trials and the convictions and the felony counts, everybody's out to get me kind of vibe. And then you get it from the president's side at the same time, the elites are against me. I mean, it's not quite the same thing, but there's just this victimhood sense and this view that everybody is being pilloried against either the president or the former president.
This is brilliant. This is why we love having Henrietta Trey on. And the word I thought of somewhat like the victim that Henrietta's talking about, David Gura, is just this sense of grievance across America, in our markets, in our discussion of Bloomberg elites and the haves, the asset owners in this America. There's almost a celebration of prosperity right now. And this is, at the same time, a nation, both parties feeling grievance.
Both parties feeling grievance. And Henrietta, if I could, I'd love to go back to sort of your experience working on Capitol Hill. You've worked on the north side and the south side, the House and the Senate. And in the hours since this attack, we have seen comments from elected representatives calling for committee hearings and investigations. Is that healthy as you see it, so soon after this, to kind of move ahead to that type of investigation? And sort of what do you want to see the role of official Washington and the legislative branch playing here as we learn more information?
I think it's appropriate to hold hearings and, make sure that the safety of any of our elected officials is paramount. I fear for that all the time. I'm one of the kinds of people who really respects a lot of our elected officials, and I want them to be safe so that more people will join the fray and we get better talent to join the ranks of the House and the Senate members. I think that serves America in general. So if there is to be hearings and to discuss the role of the Secret Service, I mean, all the things that went right, you know, the former president is safe, he is sound, you know, that's a testament to their good work. I don't know that committee hearings being weaponized is good for America. That's certainly something that we have seen.